sessions.
Yeah. Well, thank you all for joining us here today at the American Enterprise Institute. I'm Brian Miller. I'm a non-resident fellow here and also on the faculty at Hopkins, where I'm practicing hospitalist. Very excited to have Representative Dan Crenshaw here to talk about the Valley of Death. Not meant to be a scary title. It's about the gap between FDA approval and CMS payment for medical devices, technology, even services. And this has long been a concern in the health policy community, that you get over the hump of the FDA and then you have to redo all of your evidence or recast all of your evidence to get coverage and payment. And so this deprives Americans of access to innovative items and services, as the Medicare folks would say. And it's a personal issue for many of us, because we think about innovation and we think about spreadsheets and PowerPoint decks, and you read scientific papers and you think about populations and people with diseases. But disease happens to individuals, and that's something that the policy community often forgets, and my medical colleagues and I often, frankly, forget that too when we're thinking about policy. And so solving this gap between FDA approval and CMS coverage is really important. I'm really glad that we have Representative Crenshaw here. I can think of no better person to speak about this. He has a lot of personal experience from himself and his family as to the value of medical innovation. And he served our country, and he's a pragmatic guy who speaks his mind, and that's very refreshing. And frankly, is uncommon in health policy, and we need more of that, right? We need accountability, we need oversight, and we need pragmatic ideas that can work. So I'm very glad to have you here, and let's all give him a round of applause.
Thank you. Instead of going to the podium, I'm just going to try and summarize and I guess frame the discussion, and we'll go from there. You really turned the tables on me because I interviewed you on my podcast because you're the expert, and so expect maybe some of these questions to be turned right back at you. But I'm one of the few non-doctors on the health subcommittee, so I do try to look at this from an outside perspective, kind of an outside problem-solving perspective. I don't have any experience in the healthcare industry except as a patient, but that is important experience to some extent. Like you said, innovations saved my life. I mean, at least in the sense of like my well-being. I do a healthcare innovation summit once a year, which is one of the cooler things that I think we do, and we bring up innovators who do things from gene therapies to electromagnetic wearable devices to zap tumors to psychedelics, and we do kind of like a 15-minute TED Talk, and we give an award every year, and that award is the Susan Carroll Crenshaw Award. My mother, who was the first patient for Taxotere treatment in like 1993, and did a whole CBS or somebody did a whole news story on her. So it didn't help her, it didn't save her because we didn't understand it back then, but that was, that's how innovation works. You've got to take the risk, and you've got to try something out, figure out what the right dose is, and that saved countless lives since. So innovation's a pretty big deal. It's we talk about healthcare costs, we talk about the problems with all of the things related to healthcare. Innovation is the thing that eventually solves that. Either making a treatment cheaper or saving somebody's life or improving their situation so that they're not under constant care, which is extremely expensive. So innovation is important. And talk about a valley of death, well, it makes it harder to innovate. You've got years and years and billions of dollars that needs to be put into the clinical trials to get your FDA approval. We could talk about that forever too, is in the problematic issues there and those pathways. But less talked about, of course, is the Valley of Death with CMS, wherein they're effectively duplicating the efforts to examine the efficacy of a drug or a therapy or a treatment or a device. And there's a real question out there as to why they're doing that. Why, and it's an inconsistent action as well. Sometimes it seems very smooth and they trust FDA's findings, and then other times they're like, I'm not so sure about that. Maybe it's not as effective as FDA says it is, or or maybe it's not worth the price. Now, insurance companies, of course, make that same judgment, and that would be a good guiding light, because insurance companies from the private sector are making that judgment based on their own assessment of effectiveness and whether that'll help the patient and reduce costs overall. CMS should operate that way, but it's a bureaucracy, so it probably doesn't the way that it should. And they don't necessarily even take cues from the private market sometimes, when the private market might have already decided to cover something and the CMS is not following suit. That's a problem, and we start adding up all the years it takes to get to somewhere, and investors have to look at that and say, well, that doesn't seem worth it. And then you're going to have less of the things because you were so concerned about being so careful. And this is a broader philosophical discussion about regulations in general, like, the idea of safety at any cost, right? I can keep you perfectly safe. I'll just put you in a prison and I'll feed you and you will never touch and speak to anyone. You will be safe. But that's, of course, the logical extreme of regulations. And you got to have a balance with freedom and a little bit of risk if you're gonna actually have any good outcomes. So I think that's sort of what I had written here, and I think that's what we want to talk about today. And we have those discussions on the committee, and I think that's also a natural divide between the left and the right. The left is always going to want more safety, and I think on the right we are a little. I think we should be a little bit more balanced. You should of course have safety regulations and make sure that a drug is safe and effective, but you've got to promote innovation. We have 3 times more investment in our country than into the life sciences than Europe does, and there's a reason for that. Our dynamic economy, for one, but also this and our private markets that'll actually pay for the stuff. But the government shouldn't be constantly trying to get in the way of that. I think that's what we're here to discuss today.
It's interesting you mentioned risk. Obviously, we want things to be safe and effective, but our perception of risk is often wrong, right? Me driving my car is actually an extremely dangerous activity.
It is.
Some would say for other people. I would say for myself. When we think about policy, though, in particular for FDA and for CMS, as I said, I've always believed that policy is made for populations and experienced by individuals.
Yeah.
I once, my late mother had Alzheimer's and obviously didn't really have any therapeutic options at the time. And I remember arguing with a medical director over whether she qualified for hospice. And they were reading this criteria back to me. And I remember saying, well, she can't move, but she's functionally bedbound. And we had an argument about it. And they were talking about a policy, and I was talking about an individual. And eventually I was able to get my mother the services that she needed at the end of her life, but that we need policy to be flexible. So you obviously understand this. You lost an eye while serving America.
I know where it is.
Yeah.
It's in a trash can in Kandahar.
So, what do you think that, and the doctors and technology made it so that your other eye you can still see. Technology made that possible. What do you think America is good about with technology? How is America functionally good in this setting?
Well, America's the best at everything. It's not just the fact that we improve everybody else's food and do all that, but America's kind of built on this sort of layered foundational approach. That's how our founders wrote the founding documents, right? They studied history and studied what worked and what didn't. And so when you kind of look at development and progress in America, it's like things stacked on top of each other. Like we took all the best ideas and we wrote them down, and then we went from there. And I think one of the big battles we have in our current society is this romantic desire to sort of tear it all down, start from zero, because people see problems and they don't appreciate all of the good things. And there's a mass dysphoria in America right now where we don't appreciate all of the good things. So what do we do well in innovation? I mean, it goes so much further back. Like how do you get to a point where you can actually operate on an eyeball? You know, this like super sensitive piece of tissue, and God, the operations that they did on me, even like recently, because my retina detached recently in the last couple of years, and the scleral band surgery is gruesome. You should look it up on YouTube. It's the most gruesome thing. How did you even get there? And it's like, it's not just America, it's thousands of years of human innovation, and that's built on risk and trying things out and scientific method, and somebody makes one thing that helps somebody else make another thing, like a scalpel. And it goes so much further back, and you have to create a governing system that allows that progress to happen in a safe and effective way, but still promoting the progress of it. And I would say that the U.S. is one of the last bastions that conserves that sort of innovation. And we still do it better than everybody else, but it's a constant fight. It's the often quoted Reagan quote about freedom is never more than one generation away from extinction. That can apply to a lot of things, and that's snuffing out regulation in the name of saving somebody, saving a life, and yes, it's experienced by policy is experienced by the individual, but you also have to be careful not to make policy based on one individual problem either. Right. You've got to really balance how we assess problems, and a lot of these, I think, overly cumbersome regulations do come from a outsized view of the problem, and you always got to step back and be like, well, what is the problem we're trying to solve here? And some of the questions I think you're going to ask, we're going to have some examples there.
That's actually, so my personal interest obviously is in automation and clinical practice and making things more efficient, right? Because next week I'm going to be working in the hospital, and hospitals operate, I always like to say it's like a 747 with analog controls and no autopilot. So you're flying here to California and you're like white knuckling it at the controls every step of the way. And you have 20,000 switches in front of you. No way to filter information. You don't have you have limited decisional support. In the case of the 747 pilot.
You're scaring me as a patient right now with your analogy of what a hospital is like.
It's very scary, right? And so automation is actually a really good thing to help us be safer, more effective, and give us more time to actually talk with patients and hopefully be empathetic. So right now, what's happening though is that CMS is often reevaluating efficacy and duplicating work that the FDA is already doing.
Yeah.
So my view is that the FDA looks at what's safe and effective, and shouldn't the CMS just decide if it's going to cover technology or not and price it, and not be in the clinical evidence generation business?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, and how we write that into law is another question. And I'm not sure any of us have figured that out exactly yet. And what's the right wording that you use? Wording is really important. I mean, like that argument you had with that person about whether your mother should be in hospice right there, you're arguing about how the wording is of a certain policy. So you got to get it right, because you also don't want to go too far and say, well, you just got to cover everything. Right. And that's a massive cost to the taxpayer. But there should still be some value-based proposition that CMS is engaging in. But it has to be really consistent, and I think more importantly for innovators, it's got to be predictable. And so, maybe forcing them to reduce that timeline, and ensuring that it really is about price. If you really hate something, you could price it so low that nobody's going to use it. You would at least cover it. And because the other problem is, of course, is the private insurers take their cues from CMS. And if something's good and CMS is just dragging their feet, or what often happens is, it could just be that one person who has that case in CMS who's just he's just bad at his job or whatever. And that happens at FDA too. You have the improper person reviewing a case. And that's a really hard thing from a policy perspective to control for. Right. And again, I'm not sure how to solve that. That's an administration problem. You've got to hire the right people and make sure that they're following protocol, but also being forward-leaning. The easiest thing for a bureaucrat to do is to say no. It's the easiest thing in the world. And our job as legislators is to make them say yes. I mean, the DOD did not like my bill to make them do clinical trials in psychedelics with active duty service members. Trust me, they did not like it. And they worked through staff to try and kill it. Also, another reason why term limits are maybe not the best idea, because if you have inexperienced congressmen all the time, they don't know when to actually see that kind of stuff coming. So that can be another hour-long debate if we want with AEI. But so yeah, to summarize all that, no, CMS should at least take its cues, and then maybe we force them to do that somehow from FDA, who are already doing the efficacy portion of it. I think we're agreements there. How to do it is another question.
Because my thought is with the IRA dumping $3 billion of administrative cost into CMS, it's clear that you don't need that for 10, 20, or even 100 drugs. To me, that seems like it's an attempt to transform CMS into NICE, or the National Institute for Clinical Effectiveness in the UK, and set up a health technology transform the government payer into a health technology assessor for basically all technology and services and drugs.
Yeah.
Do you agree?
I don't know what it's hard for me to always understand what the other side wants to do with all the money they want to spend. It should be used for hiring the right people to get these applications done. That's what it should be used for. But your point is well taken. That it could be, it has the opposite effect and turns it into an even more bloated bureaucracy that slows down the entire process and makes us look more like the UK is a disaster, right? I mean, even it is a crisis right now. So the UK is basically a VA. Canada is basically Medicare for all. The UK is everyone is part of the VA. That's what it is. Everyone works for NHS, and it's not working. It just doesn't work. Again, bureaucrats have an incentive to say no. Bureaucrats don't. They're not incentivized by price and competition. These are really important factors if you want your system to work better. I remember getting asked and kind of stumped on this by Joe Rogan. He asked me because we were talking healthcare, and kind of surprised me with the question, and I thought of a better answer later, but it was why isn't healthcare like a firefighter, like a fire department? And I was I tried to come up with some funny economic answer about public goods and stuff, but the real answer is a fire department doesn't have to innovate. That's the real answer. And a fire department deals with a fire. It doesn't deal with the rebuilding of the house after the fire.
Right.
It doesn't treat the burn victims. It just puts out a fire. It doesn't do all. So it's it's an apples and orange comparison, but it is important to help people understand that, because a lot of people do have that same question, and that's basically the Medicare for all argument, is why isn't it just like a public good? Why isn't it like a fire department? Well, because it's not. It's not even a worthy debate. Because it's apples and oranges. They're totally different things, and if you treat it like a fire department, you end up with NHS in 6 to 8 months, wait times, or refusal to even do the treatments in the first place. And they don't approve a lot of things, and it's NICE it's not very nice. It doesn't approve a lot of cutting edge drugs. I mean, we have twice the approvals of drugs in the US versus Europe, something like that. And so they just don't have access. It's just reduced access. It's guaranteed low quality healthcare. So Canadians come here for their high quality healthcare. We might want to buy our generic drugs from them, so but if you have a really bad disease, you better come to Houston or Johns Hopkins.
Yeah. No, it's interesting you mentioned that. So just pulling a little bit on the centralization thread, people like unitary decisions.
They like simple answers to
simple
complex
answer.
questions.
And for a lot of this, there isn't a simple answer. Well, science is not always exact. There's a range of truths. As we've learned from many recent events, that there's a range of opinions, and many of those opinions can be valid. And so suppressing different interpretations of science, which is what happens when you have a single payer interpreting what the decision is for coverage, is actually, in some ways, not scientific.
Yeah, no, I didn't even think about it that way, but that's absolutely correct. But we're dangerously close to that situation anyway, again, because private insurers take their cues from CMS. You are already dangerously close to that reality, and it's all the more reason for a need for just more flexibility in that approval process, and maybe a stronger message to CMS, we already did the efficacy examination with FDA. You don't just, there's no reason that you need to double down on that, and I'm not even sure you have the capacity to. and you're doing it inconsistently. And so that message needs to be loud and clear.
Right. And if the FDA is a technocratic scientific regulator, we should treat it, respect it, have appropriate oversight and accountability. But we don't go and then create a whole nother scientific technocratic regulator to do the exact same thing.
Right.
Or try and do a similar thing with a slightly different flavor. Speaking of changes in regulations, since you're here, I know that the FDA passed the 528-page LDT rule, which I think by its definition is probably inaccessible to anybody who can't hire a Washington lawyer or consultant, because it's lengthy. I mean, I haven't even finished reading the entire thing. I'm about 2/3 the way through it. It's a huge policy change a real page turn. It's the cure for insomnia. It's a massive policy change that occurred through functionally the FDA, and we talked again about like FDA and CMS sort of messing around and getting into each other's space. In the case of FDA, they usually have guidance documents. This is a 528-page rule, which makes me worried that they're turning into CMS, which has 1,000 or 2,000-page rules. And it's a policy change that occurred. The agency decided to make this change itself, right? They didn't seek additional congressional authority, and they used a latent they believe that they have a latent authority from 50 years ago, before we were born, and therefore that they can regulate these tests. Now it's interesting because I was looking, and LabCorp actually released a new test to identify preeclampsia during the first trimester of pregnancy, which is a huge win for maternal mortality.
That's a pretty big deal.
It's a huge deal, but it's a laboratory developed test.
Right. So now it's going to be regulated as a device.
Right. So
I don't know what that looks like in practice. It means time delays in millions of dollars, billions of dollars, maybe.
I mean, because isn't the LDT rule foreclosing innovation and actually potentially hurting women and minority health?
Well, in that case, it certainly is. And maybe we should explain what LDT is. I'm not sure everybody's like super familiar with
laboratory developed tests.
Yeah. And why it's so right now laboratory developed tests are approved within their own approval in FDA. FDA has a new rule to try and approve them as a device, which is complicated because LDTs they're supposed to be these like individualized dynamic tests, and they have the potential to save lives. And this was the example I was talking about when we were talking about regulation in general, and asking like what is the problem you're trying to solve before you write 500 pages of regulation. And this is, again, constant debate on our committee because, it's energy and commerce, so we do a lot of energy regulation too. And then Democrats want to stop, certain chemicals from being used in refineries. And I'm like, what is the problem you're trying to solve? Well, there was an explosion once. Was anybody hurt? No. But you want to ban 50% of refineries? Like, come on. Sorry, this isn't an energy discussion. But it's the same concept. Like, what problem are we trying to solve? Well, there's some lab-developed tests that maybe market themselves and aren't that accurate. Okay, well, that's not great. I mean, there's a risk there, but is it such a great risk that you're going to just take a hammer to the whole system? That's not a good, balanced policy view. And that's what we're fighting. And I asked, we had a hearing on this, and I asked one of our witnesses, that question, what is the problem we're trying to solve? And I don't remember exactly her answer, but it was she had the stats, and the stats are like, this isn't really a big problem. We shouldn't be taking a hammer to the entire industry just for this.
You don't do policy making by anecdote.
Right, and that's kind of what's happening here. And it's like that refinery example is the exact same thing. It's like one thing that happened, and so there's also a question on this one whether it's legal. They can and should be challenged in the courts. The Chevron deference decision, whenever that's made by the Supreme Court, if that could have big ramifications on something like this too. Could have ramifications on a lot of regulations that we don't like.
Could massively disrupt the FDA. Before I open it up to questions from the audience, so accelerated approval has been extremely controversial as of late. And my thinking on this has evolved as I've grown as a physician and seen more patients. So people seem to have forgotten in Washington why we have the accelerated approval pathway. We have it because patients who contracted HIV and developed AIDS didn't have access to antiretroviral therapy in the 80s and were dying by the thousands, and they took over the FDA. And sure enough, accelerated approval was implemented as a regulatory tool as part of the Prescription Drug User Fee Act of 1992. Today, HIV is a chronic disease. It's a huge win for the population.
Yep.
Huge win. And it's a product of pharmaceutical product innovation. Yet today, I think a lot of academics and policy experts want to use payment to sort of punish or not pay for or not cover products that are approved via or enter the market by the accelerated approval pathway. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't even know it was controversial. I don't know why it would be. I'm actually curious more into your thinking on how you changed your mind. Like, why didn't you like it at first, but you prefer it now? I'm more curious about that because it doesn't seem like a controversial thing to me. You should have an accelerated pathway. It should be narrowly focused to devices or treatments that are trying to fulfill an unmet need. I believe that's the basic threshold that you have to meet. Why it's controversial, I have no idea. Why anyone would be upset about it, and then like as you said, try to punish via the pricing system. I don't know. I'd have to see some examples so we can better understand it. And I think I always try to think like how do Democrats think about this, because anytime we do have to think about how they think about it, because that's how you get legislation done, make it a lawmaking exercise. And I'm not sure they hate it. I don't know. They're probably split on it like they are on a lot of these issues. But accelerated approvals, it's an absolute necessity.
I agree, it's an absolute necessity. The reason is, in medical school, we're taught to be risk averse. We're taught that certain types of clinical trials are the only way that you can generate evidence. And so that's what I was taught through my training. And then I actually worked at the FDA and reviewed drug development programs and worked on post-market safety and realized and ran into some people who were frankly very thoughtful and very creative and learned that there are many ways that we can look at evidence. Maybe if there are 10 potential answers to a scientific question, maybe 5 of them there's a range of 5 that are valid, and maybe 3 that most people would settle on, and 2 that make people grumpy. But accelerated approval is sort of like that, right? Because you're getting early market access based upon a surrogate endpoint, and that surrogate endpoint, of course, needs to correlate. The thought is with some clinical outcome that you desire, and actually, most of those trials get done. Like if you look at the research by the greatest critics, something like 60 to 70% are done on time, and 15 to 20% are delayed due to issues related to clinical trial enrollment. Now, the reason we should reform clinical trials and how we do it, make it easier for a diverse group of beneficiaries and people to participate. And then, 10 or 15% have other issues. And so if you get the super majority of trials that are getting done, some of which are getting done slower, but are getting completed, and then the agency is responding by either keeping the products on the market, or if they don't have that proven benefit, to then take them off, that to me is a fully functional pathway that is then giving people access to innovation earlier. And it's better than the alternative of making sure that people didn't have access to innovation earlier. Because think of the thousands, if not millions of people who benefited from early access to innovation. And so that's the error I'd rather have the agency make, rather than have the agency not approving and not allowing access to anything based upon total risk aversion, like the bubble. Like it's somewhere between the bubble and skydiving, right? Like skydiving is probably too much for the FDA to do, but having people be in like a plastic bubble, walking down the street is also probably not. And I think right now we're sort of in the middle, which is where we should be.
Skydiving does have therapeutic benefits.
It does.
It's science. I do it occasionally. I try to do it not so often that I still feel, I do it about once or twice a year so that I still feel scared. Otherwise, what's the point?
That's fair.
That's the adrenaline junkie in me, I guess.
I know we only have a couple minutes left, so I want to open up to questions from the audience. Yes.
Yeah, well, one question I had, just, listening to you talk about how some of this shouldn't be that controversial, is, like, in theory, in theory, deregulation, getting rid of a lot of the sort of bureaucratic red tape shouldn't be that partisan. So, I guess I'm wondering, I'm an intern here and I do research on South Asia in the Middle East, and places like, Pakistan. I mean, you'd be surprised at how much could probably be solved by just automating away a lot of the country's, economic problems to technocrats, right? And that's been like proposed, by people here and on the street. But obviously, ideology and special interest groups kind of come in the way. And so I'm wondering, I mean, what mechanisms are in place now that have just been kind of automated away to technocrats, that probably, might know what's best. And why don't you think maybe that would be the best idea in order to kind of get past a lot of the back and forth between the two parties in a way that, might not be productive?
I think I understand your question. I mean, everything we're talking about is basically processes by bureaucrats, technocrats. What's the difference? Congress makes a law. We say you have to do this. You have the authority to do this. This is the scope of your authority. Bureaucrats the administration has to implement it. I mean, that's sort of constitutionally how we function. Because it wouldn't make sense for members of Congress to try and do the detailed work of approving a drug or a therapy. That would be pretty wild.
We'd have much shorter reviews. Instead of being like 300 pages, we might get more 5-page memos, which would be better.
You might also just get nothing
there
done.
might be an improvement.
Yeah, I mean, that's part of the democratic process is deciding like what should be democratized and what should be, put into the bureaucracy. I'm not sure what exactly your question is on that, but when we say deregulation, we're not deregulating everything, but it's making it more flexible, more predictable too. I mean, I was going to mention as you were talking about. Some things is the Trump administration implemented the MSIT pathway. What does it stand for? It's Medicare Coverage of Innovative Technologies rules. So that was great. I mean, that's kind of what you were talking about. It's like, we know it's basically safe. Let's approve it. It's an unmet need. Let's get people access to it and let's watch it. Okay, and FDA has more and more pathways and policies that I think are moving in this direction. This sort of post-market review. Like, let's get it out there. We'll assess it. We're not going to totally forget about it, but let's be a little bit flexible because maybe it's not super. Maybe we'll find out if it's super effective. There's long term, but we know it's pretty safe. So let's let it be tried. And then the Biden administration reversed that, made that a much more cumbersome pathway, which takes years and costs a lot of money.
And as you pointed out, like you can also kill a market via pricing it. So if people are worried about runaway costs, like if you have 1,000 of something that's $1 million, it's very expensive. But if it's $1. Like, in the scheme of things, there are lots of other barriers that manufacturers face. And I think people also forget that there are other rules and regulations outside the federal government. So hospitals, you have to be credentialed as a physician in the hospital. You then have to be privileged to do certain procedures. There are medical society guidelines. There's whole other layers of regulation, even outside the FDA and CMS and just outside of federal law that also govern medical practice.
Yeah.
Plus, of course, negligence, right? Like malpractice. If you harm someone and violate the standard of care, you can be sued.
Yeah.
So there's lots. So in addition to FDA regulation, in addition to payment, there's also hospital and facility regulation of practice. And then there's peer professional regulation. And then there are also professional society guidelines. So there's a long list of things. So when we talk about, getting back to your original question about deregulation, it's not about just blindly getting rid of things. It's about making things more flexible and then recognizing that there's a whole range that affects medical practice.
Yeah. Healthcare is just one of those. I'll just kind of keep talking, but raise your hand if you have a question. Just interrupt us, it's fine, so we know. But otherwise, we'll just blab on. Healthcare is one of those. It's the trickiest market there is because it's in the category of a need. Democrats say it's a right. Well, it can't be a right because you don't have a right to somebody else's services. That's you can't say that. That's not how we view rights in Western society. You have a right not to be punched in the face by me, but that's a negative right. That's not a positive right. So when they say right, they mean a service. So you have a right to healthcare in Canada, but it doesn't mean you have access to it because you can't force a doctor to actually work. But it is a need. Like just like housing and water, like it is something you
Maslow's
need. And
basic hierarchy.
and we already say it's a need by law because the ER has to treat you if you show up, whether you can pay or not. So we already have established in our society that it's a need, but it also requires market forces to function properly. It requires competition, price transparency, all that, if we want it to keep going to where we want it to go. Otherwise, we'll be stuck in Canada and the UK's system, which is, okay, like we could, if healthcare was a pill, like, and that's all it was, then you could make a good moral argument that everyone should get that access. But that's not what it is. It's so much more complicated than that. And so you can't compare it to like, we gave everybody the vaccine. And that's you can't treat all of healthcare like that because it's more complicated, requires more innovation, requires more treatments, and it's apples and oranges. It looks like he has a question.
Yeah. Hi, Congressman. Thank you for being here. I was wondering about, you've already talked about how the AIDS crisis has affected policy in this area, and I'm also thinking of, during COVID, we had a lot of pharmaceutical innovation with the vaccines and Operation Warp Speed that moved things along really quickly. Some people have observed that in like the modern Congress, some of the only times legislation really gets passed with any speed is when there's a real sense of like emergency behind it. The Congress urgently needs to do something about it. So I'm wondering, whenever we're talking about innovation, we never see like the pitches for medicines that don't get funding properly, right? And that might have succeeded, but didn't because of the regulatory system we have set up. So how do you create like a sense of, there are people dying who, if we had different regulations, there might be medicines to help. But how do you create a real sense of emergency around that, or a sense of urgency at least that would get people interested, especially on the Hill?
Well, it's hard. Healthcare is important to people, but if you're polling voters on what matters to them most, it's like right now it's probably like 5th, 6th, 7th, because you got open border, you got inflation. There's other things that people are immediately thinking about. And so, I'm not sure it's totally a bad thing that Congress only acts with extreme expediency when there's a big, huge national emergency, because I'm not sure I want Congress doing a ton of things all the time based on an emotional whim. Like that's a little scary, actually, and our founders were really scared of that. That's why they created a Senate and forced these checks and balances on us. It's harder to get things through. It should be hard to make a law that applies to the entire country, full of very different policies and people and demographics. It should be hard. It should be slow. So it's always going to be hard to make really complicated issues like soundbite worthy and get the news to talk about them all the time. That I'm sorry, it just is what it is. I don't see a political way out of that reality, but it doesn't relieve us from our duty to think more creatively about this. And for Republicans, like we just have to think more creatively about how we message healthcare. Like if your average person doesn't really know what we stand for, they know Democrats stand for Medicare for all. We need to have a vision for healthcare where we really sell that to the public. But it's getting the public to care. That's another issue. It kind of depends on what's going on in the news that day.
I would say innovation and technology and access to that to make care more convenient, more accessible, more personalized, more customized, right? Everything from AI helping the doctor write their notes to new drugs like gene therapies, and just making that built around the actual patient so that they don't have to worry. Because when people go into the hospital and they go see the doctor, they're worried. I mean, you've been there. Like they're worried, am I going to be able to see? Am I going to be able to walk? Am I going to live? Like, will I be able to spend time with my family? And just not have them have to worry about that and worry about paperwork for private.
Well, that's why it's also so easy to sell Medicare for all, because you definitely don't want to be worried about the financing when you're in crisis mode. And so it is up to us to one, explain why Medicare for all creates worse circumstances for you. The other reason it's hard to make that case is because you're trying to prove a negative. Like, so this is the case with the IRA, Inflation Reduction Act, basically implemented H.R. 3, which was the Democrats' bill to force negotiations on new drugs. And and if you don't take that negotiated price, you get like a 95% tax on your revenue, not even profit, but revenue. So it was like a gun to your head kind of negotiation. And so we're all saying, like, you're going to have less drugs, you're going to have less innovation, and there's plenty of studies that show that. But in the end, the reality is I can't prove it because I don't have access to the multiverse like Loki does. So it's But if you did, then you could get people excited because you could show them like, look, this was the reality. This is what you could have had, but Democrats wouldn't let you. But I can't do that. I'm trying to figure it out. Maybe we would have a unified theory of physics like Terrence Williams claims he has. If you've seen that Joe Rogan episode, holy crap. But until then, it's very hard to make those arguments.
Oh, thanks very much. I love the point about right versus need. I think not enough people talking about that. I wanted to ask you about patents, if you don't mind. And there was a hearing in the Senate Judiciary Committee this week on patents on prescription drugs, and there seemed to be violent agreement among committee members on two things. One is that if there's more than one patent on an end product, that must be a problem. And the other is that if something is expensive, it must be overpriced. I just wonder what would you say if you had a chance to talk privately or publicly with those senators?
I don't know. I didn't see the hearing, but I mean, so generally, like when HR 3, back when Democrats were in control and they had HR 3, which was the price negotiation in a bill that they eventually got passed into law through the IRA. The alternative we had to that was HR 19, which was, I think, a more tailored approach to dealing with because it is a problem in the drug manufacturing pharmaceutical industry where they sort of gimmick, they use gimmicks to get additional protections on their product. They change like one little thing, and then that does need to be regulated better. You shouldn't be able to cheat the system because the goal should be like, look, you need to make your money back. We need to promote innovation. I want the incentives to be there to innovate that new drug, but also it has to expire at a certain point, and the generics have to be able to compete. And so that was the thinking there, and that's as it relates to pharmaceuticals. That's where the patent discussion comes into play. You've got to improve upon that.
Well, I know that you have someplace you have to go to, and that we have kept you for more than we were supposed to.
We did. I don't know. I don't even know what her.
I really appreciate you coming to join us.
Yeah.
And let's all give Representative Crenshaw a round of applause.
Thank you.
And we'll